Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I would like to make a statement on tax avoidance, evasion and compliance. This government takes a balanced approach to the public finances, investing in our vital public services while getting our debt down and keeping tax as low as possible. And part of that approach, Mr. Speaker, is that everybody should pay the tax that is properly due. The vast majority of taxpayers, from individuals and the smallest businesses to the largest companies, already pay their fair share. This government recognises its duty to that compliant majority to build a fair and sustainable taxation system, and through that system to make sure that those who try to avoid or evade their tax liabilities are held to account. Mr. Speaker, our approach is working. At 5.7%, the tax gap is at a near record low. The difference between the tax that should be paid to HMRC and the actual tax that has been paid is at its joint lowest level in 5 years. This is thanks to HMRC's sustained efforts to tackle non-compliance and to help customers get their tax affairs right the first time. Mr. Speaker, HMRC tailors its approach to different taxpayers, subjecting the largest businesses and the wealthiest individuals to the largest level of scrutiny, whilst using data and digital tools to help smaller and mid-sized businesses to get it right, with close attention to those where avoidance or evasion is suspected. On the one hand, we must make sure the tax system is not a barrier to setting up, running or growing a business, but we should never forget that the tax brought in by HMRC directly funds our vital public services. And I am proud, Mr. Speaker, of this government's success in this respect. Since 2010, we have introduced over 100 measures to tackle tax avoidance, evasion and other forms of non-compliance. Alongside this, HMRC's compliance work has secured and protected £200 billion in tax revenue which would otherwise have gone unpaid. In addition, at Budget 2018, the Government announced a further 21 measures which, together, are forecast to raise around £2.1 billion by 2023-24. This success, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates the Government's continued efforts to address tax avoidance, evasion and non-compliance in all of its forms. At the same time, the Government recognises that these efforts must be designed and carefully targeted. All HMRC's powers which are given by Parliament must be accompanied by the necessary safeguards to ensure that they are used correctly. The Government will keep the tax administration framework under review in consultation with interested external stakeholders to ensure that it continues to strike the right balance between robustly challenging tax avoidance, evasion and other forms of deliberate non-compliance and treating all taxpayers fairly. Mr. Speaker, as part of our continuing efforts to reduce the gap between money owed and money paid, the Government has also set about reforming the rules that govern off-payroll working. These rules, known as IR35, were first introduced in the year 2000 to ensure people working through their own company, who, but for the existence of the company, would be taxed as employees, pay broadly the same tax and national insurance as other employees. The rules do not affect the genuinely self-employed, and the Government recognises the contribution that contractors make to business and to public services right across the country. Our aim is simply to ensure that contractors who work through their own company pay the right tax. However, evidence has suggested that these rules have been frequently misapplied, meaning that contractors were incorrectly paying tax as if they were self-employed when they were actually acting as employees. Mr. Speaker, it is right and fair that everyone must pay the tax that is due, irrespective of the nature of their employment. We want a tax system that is simple and clear to use, so that businesses and individuals alike can understand what they owe and how and when to pay it. In April 2017, the Government introduced new rules for public sector organisations who take on contractors through their own company. The reform means that public sector organisations are now responsible for deciding both whether the contractor is acting as an employee and therefore within the rules, and also for ensuring the right amount of tax is paid. I am pleased to report to the House that this has proved to be effective, with HMRC estimating that an additional £550 million has been raised in income tax and national insurance contributions in the first 12 months since the measure was introduced. However, non-compliance in the private sector remains a persistent and growing problem, which, if left unchecked, will cost the taxpayer as much as £1.3 billion by 2022-23, according to the government's estimates. In last year's budget, the government announced that we will extend the reform of off-payroll working rules to the private sector from April 2020. And tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, we will publish a consultation to seek views on the detailed design of the reform to enable effective implementation. Mr. Speaker, by changing the design of the off-payroll working rules, we are helping individuals working in this way to ensure that they are compliant with the existing legislation. For this reason, the government's focus will be on supporting organisations and businesses to apply the rules rather than enforcing historic cases. Our aim is to provide individuals and businesses with greater certainty around how the off-payroll working rules will operate from April 2020 and the actions that individuals and businesses can take to prepare for the reform. Mr. Speaker, our reforms to off-payroll working are just one of the ways in which this government is ensuring that we have a tax system that is fit for the 21st century, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jonathan Reynolds. Mr. Speaker, the opposition came to Parliament today prepared to debate, to amend and to scrutinise the Financial Services Implementation Bill. And we did so in good faith, even though we were given just 3 hours to table amendments to the bill last week, having been told on Wednesday afternoon that the remaining stages would be today. I should make clear, Mr. Speaker, that bill only came out of committee the day before, on Tuesday. And of course the business for this week was only announced on Thursday last week. So let me be absolutely frank. The bill has been pulled and this statement scheduled instead for one simple reason, which is the government thought it was going to lose. They have showed such contempt for Parliament today and are in such a state of chaos that even the enunciator couldn't keep up with them this morning. So this is not a statement from the government on tax avoidance. It is a poor attempt to put up something that the government can hide behind because it is afraid to let members of Parliament vote on the provisions of the Financial Services Bill. Now, there were two main amendments to that bill today. The first would have prevented the bill legislating for any race to the bottom in regulatory standards if we crash out of the EU without a deal, something the government says it is committed to. And the second, standing in the name of my right honourable friend for Barking and the right honourable member for Sutton Coldfield, would have compelled the introduction of public registers of beneficial ownership in the Crown dependencies and reiterated their introduction in the overseas territories. That's something the government has already committed to do. So it is woeful and embarrassing to pull the business of the House today in order to avoid Parliament having a say on these amendments and to have this statement made instead. And in relation to the substantive point on tax evasion which has led to this, I know the Crown dependencies have a difference of opinion with this Parliament on the merits of public registers of beneficial ownership. But there is, I believe, a majority view in Parliament that public registers provide for greater transparency than the existing data sharing protocols between ourselves and the Crown dependencies that they provide for. Public scrutiny would provide for analysis of suspicious patterns of behaviour. It would disclose inconsistencies in supposedly factual information and reveal wrongdoing from people who may not already be the subject of official law enforcement action. Around the world, when information has got into the public domain, it has been essential to exposing tax evasion and corruption, from the laundromat scandal to the Panama Papers. And the public want to see action. In relation to what the Minister has actually said today, all I can ask him is if his reference to not enforcing historic cases is code for the government not proceeding with the 2019 loan charge. His words suggest they might not be proceeding, but he didn't really say one way or another. And if the answer is that it's not proceeding, I'm not really sure, with due respect to him, why I need to make any statement today at all. But, Mr. Speaker, let me return to the main point. If we had debated the Financial Services Bill today, I'd intended to start with a genuine word of solidarity with my opposite number, the Economic Secretary, who was also the MP for Salisbury, because it is exactly a year since the appalling attack in his constituency that featured chemical weapons. And I still want to take this opportunity to express our support and solidarity with him and the people of his constituency. But I mention this now because one of the reasons this House is united on a cross-party basis to push for new laws in this area is precisely because transparency in overseas jurisdictions has become an issue of national security for us in the UK. We cannot and we should not tolerate people who threaten the safety of our people with being able to hold major assets in the UK through complex and opaque financial arrangements. And in light of that, the government's words today are simply not good enough. How can it be that if there is consensus in this House that action must be taken now, that the government can simply deny us not only the chance to vote for further action, but a chance to vote to reaffirm the action we've already agreed and passed through the House of Commons? Real action on tax avoidance, transparency and money laundering is well overdue. And if the government cannot bring itself to do that, then it should stop preventing other members of Parliament from getting on with the job themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman for his reply. He spent some time focusing on the legislation that was due to be before the House this evening. And what I would say to that is that some amendments have been tabled, particularly the second amendment to which the honourable gentleman referred, which would or potentially could have significant constitutional ramifications for our Crown dependencies and overseas territories. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I think it only right that we have time, given that the amendments were only tabled on Thursday of last week, to consider these very important matters, and they are not actually directly Treasury matters. They are more a matter for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Ministry of Justice. He also referred to wanting to see public registers of beneficial ownership of companies, and he neglected to mention, Mr. Speaker, that we have already introduced these in respect of UK companies, and that came in 2016, and that database has actually been accessed in excess of 2 billion times. And he did make reference to the fact that we have made commitments already in respect of overseas territories to working with them to bring those measures in by 2023. He asked me specifically what the meaning was in the context of IR35 on focusing particularly on future compliance rather than on the history of the businesses that would be in scope for this measure. And I think that is simply a clear indication that this is not about trawling through previous activities. This is about looking to the future and making sure we have a fair, proportionate and reasonable approach to IR35 as it goes into the private sector. He asked me specifically, Mr. Speaker, whether there are any implications for the loan charge in any sense of this, and I know that people often conflate IR35 and the loan charge and disguised remuneration. They are, as the honourable gentleman will appreciate, entirely different things, and there is no implication in any element of my statement as to any changes in respect of the loan charge. He also made the very important point, and I think he related this to our national security, the importance of general transparency in business and tax affairs internationally. I would remind him, Mr. Speaker, that it is this government and this country that has been at the forefront of the base erosion profit shifting project with the OECD. It's this country that has helped drive our common reporting standards, which provides information across 100 different overseas tax jurisdictions. And I think with that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude, as I think I have addressed the points raised by the honourable gentleman.
Next, Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I think the Minister, who I respect greatly, has been handed an enormous hospital pass today, perhaps not as great as the Secretary of State for Health was passed earlier on in terms of justifying the conduct of one of his other Cabinet colleagues. Can I ask the Minister, though, just to build on what the Shadow Minister was saying, the point in his statement where he says the government's focus will be on supporting organisations and businesses to apply the rules rather than enforcing historic cases, is it the case that the government has learnt from the 2019 loan charge cases where people are very concerned about the enforcement of historic cases rather than looking forward? Is the Minister saying that these changes will be done differently from what we are seeing under the loan charge?
Right Honourable Lady for her question, my right honourable friend. To reiterate, Mr. Speaker, there is no connection between the issue of the loan charge and IR35. They are two distinctly different aspects of government taxation policy. The purpose of my statement to make it clear that we're not going to be actively or aggressively in any way looking at previous activities in this area, is that we recognise that we need to get this right. We recognise that we need to support employers and contractors as we go through this process, and that is the approach that we will take.
Alison Thewlis.
Mr. Speaker, we should have been debating the Financial Services Implementation of Legislation Bill this evening, but this UK Government is clearly feared. Can the Minister tell us when this bill will return to the House? Because we were told before that it was vital, that it was urgent, that it was necessary in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and today we find it's evaporated. The statement today is nothing but a fig leaf, really, to give cover to the embarrassment the UK Government feel on the amendment from the Right Honourable Members for Sutton Coldfield and Barking, because they should have acted on this after the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill, but on public registers of beneficial ownership, they've been taking their lead from the Prime Minister and have kicked the can down the road to 2023. On IR35 and the loan charge, can the Minister tell me what assessment he's done on how many people were forced into this system by their employer, what action had been taken in the employers involved in those cases, and how many people were separate to that, to perhaps knowingly use the system to avoid tax, because it seems to me that those are two very separate classes of people, and it should be recognised in how we go forward and how those people are treated. And on compliance and enforcement, this government has a very poor record, because they have planned, they have closed already HMRC offices in Scotland whose local knowledge played a vital and valuable role in enforcement and in their local knowledge in seeking to make sure that there was no tax avoidance and evasion going on and enforcing compliance. As my honourable friend from Cumbernauld, Kilsyth and Kirkintilloch East highlighted, will he put the plans to close the HMRC office there on hold, because it is a vital part in the tax avoidance, tax evasion and compliance regime? And finally, Mr. Speaker, will he take action to make Companies House part of the anti-money laundering regime, which would actually close a huge loophole within the system that allow people to falsely register companies? And will he take action on Scottish limited partnerships, which are still allowing people to hide money and to move it around? And last time I asked on SLPs, there were still thousands who had not registered as a person of significant control but had not been fined. Would he not have an interest as a Treasury Minister in having that significant amount of money in the Treasury coffers rather than going unpaid?
Hear, hear. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Honourable lady asked as to when today's business will return to the House. That will be a matter for the business managers and the usual channels in the usual way. She asked regarding the loan charge and specifically about those who will be impacted by it. I can tell her that of the £1 billion that has been received by HMRC via pre-loan charge settlement, some 85% of those settlements by value are from companies rather than from individuals, and it is companies, Mr. Speaker, that HMRC will go for in the first instance. She raised the issue of the HMRC offices up and down the country. We are going through a transformation programme, as the Honourable Lady will know, reducing the number of offices from 170, some of which had fewer than 10 staff in them, in order to produce 13 state-of-the-art hubs which are moving our tax authorities into the 21st century, where so much more is done through analysis, through computers and intelligent interventions. And I was very privileged last week, Mr. Speaker, to visit our new office in Bristol, which will be the hub for the southwest of England, and it is a truly stunning building that will be a state-of-the-art approach to tax collection. The Honourable Lady raised Scottish limited partnerships and urged the government to take action. She will know that we have already taken action in that respect. And I think overall, Mr. Speaker, the main point remains, I think, that we have been very successful with keeping our tax gap at one of the lowest in the world and safeguarding and protecting some £200 billion worth of tax, which, let us not forget, Mr. Speaker, is there for a purpose. It is to support our vital public services, our doctors and our nurses and our brave service men and women and our police force. We need that money, and that is why I am proud of our achievements in that area.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right to say that the best approach is to get it right for the future rather than to overemphasise enforcement on the past, particularly where people may well have acted in good faith. in relation when they've received professional advice. That does bring me back to the loan charge, and I will press him in this regard. The government accepted a new clause to the finance bill involving a review of the loan charge. For that to be meaningful, it must A, have an independent element to it, and B, must be given time to do its work. Would not common justice indicate that the sensible thing is to use the discretion which the revenue has to suspend implementation of the loan charge against individuals, at any rate, until that review has been fully completed and its conclusions fully digested and debated?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the review or the report to which we committed during the passage of the finance bill was to provide a report by the 30th of March, which is very shortly to be upon us, and in fact, of course, is a date that is prior to the moment, as you know, Mr. Speaker, when the loan charge will come into effect at the beginning of this coming tax year. But I think the most important point here, and my right honourable friend referred to those individuals getting involved in these schemes as to whether they knew what these schemes were all about, that if something looks too good to be true and you end up really basically being asked for no or very little tax, then it probably doesn't work, and that indeed, I'm afraid, is the case.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know, Mr. Speaker, that this government finds it very difficult to listen to anybody and to accept the will of Parliament and legislation if it doesn't like what it says. It now has form on the issue. But I want to ask the Minister two questions, one in relation to the overseas territories and one in relation to the Crown dependencies. On the overseas territories, it is utterly shameful for this government to ignore legislation that was enacted only last year and to invent its own date for implementation of public registers of beneficial ownership there. If the government is serious about wanting to tackle tax avoidance, tax evasion, financial crime and money laundering, it ought to be acting with greater speed and not delaying the implementation of legislation and ignoring the will of Parliament. Will the Minister explain to us why on earth the government is doing that? And on Crown dependencies, I can't for the life of me understand how he can pray in aid the constitutional implications of this House legislating on a matter which was perfectly in scope in relation to the bill that this House is considering and perfectly in order on the matters that it was attempting to address. Such praying in aid of inadequate and ill-thought-through reasons simply will not do. Indeed, I can't understand why the Minister does not recognise the consensus across this House on this issue. Transparency is utterly vital tool in fighting tax avoidance, evasion and financial crime. And all we want is that transparency to exist across the family. Surely it would be better for the Minister to concede gracefully the will of Parliament rather than battling limply to a defeat in the future.
Well, I thank the right honourable lady, and I can assure her I do always listen extremely carefully to what she has to say, as I have done in the context of her current question, or two questions, in fact. As to the first, the right honourable lady asks why we are delaying, as she terms it, the implementation of public registers of beneficial interest for overseas territories. And the short answer is that it's important that we allow time to make sure that we get these things right. Not least, actually, that it is our Parliament that is legislating on behalf of another jurisdiction, albeit one that is closely related to ourselves. So I think it's important that we are considered and measured in that way. The second question the right honourable lady asks related to Crown dependencies, and she made the point, quite legitimate point actually, that the amendment to the legislation that was due to go through this afternoon was indeed, I believe, in scope and in order. However, that's not the same thing as saying that that contradicts my earlier point, that particular amendment would have considerable and significant constitutional ramifications for our Crown dependencies. And for that reason, as I stated earlier, Mr. Speaker, the government feels it's important that we reflect carefully upon that before we come back with the legislation in due course.
Mr. Nigel Mills.
Can I welcome the statement before us, if not its existence, at least its content? Can I just ask the Minister, when he says he wants to support individuals, can he create a mechanism where someone can have their standard contract pre-cleared by HMRC? So if they engage with half a dozen customers a year, they won't get half a dozen different treatments chosen by those companies when they put the contract through their tool or something.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this whole issue of ensuring that we make it as simple as possible for employers to be able to assess the employment status of employees or contractors providing services is extremely important. It is central to the consultation that I have announced will be opened tomorrow and run for several weeks, and I would urge my honourable friend to contribute to that with his specific ideas.
Christine Jardine.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister explain why in a day when the Government pulled business to avoid defeat on an amendment which could have meant the wealthiest businesses paying millions of pounds in tax, that the Government feels it's acceptable to clamp down on ordinary families about national insurance and not pursue widespread, large-scale tax avoidance?
Well, I think it's the first part of the Honourable Lady's question. I think I've already answered the issue as to why we've decided not to go ahead with the legislation today. As to the second part, in clamping down on national insurance issues, I'm not entirely sure specifically to what she is referring, but certainly after this statement, if she'd like to have a word with me, I'm very happy to have a look at that for.
Mr. Philip Oliver.
Can I accuse the Minister directly of encouraging a very large number of people to avoid tax? Isn't it the case that in 2010, when Conservatives came into government, low-paid people only had to earn £6,500 a year before they paid income tax? But from next month, the income tax threshold is going to be £12,500. Can I accuse the Minister of taking millions of people out of income tax altogether? And isn't the fundamental truth that if you lower tax rates, you increase tax take by encouraging economic growth, giving us all more money to spend on public services?
Can I thank my honourable friend, and can I take that on the chin, Mr. Speaker, and say that I'm bang to rights? I and this government are guilty of lowering taxes, particularly for the lowest paid in our country, and he referred to the increase of the personal allowance. He's absolutely right, with some 4 million people since 2010 being taken out of tax altogether, a fact that I'm extremely proud of. And the second point that I would make, and it's often suggested by the opposition, from the opposition benches, that somehow the wealthiest get away with it. Well, they certainly don't. Under us, the top 1% pay 28% of all income tax. Under Labour, it was about 24.5%.
Catherine McKennell.
Speaker, isn't the Government's decision to pull the Financial Services Bill today, in the face of the amendment on public registered beneficiary ownership tabled by my formidable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Barking, just reflective of this Government's entire approach to the wider issue? Can the Minister confirm when the Government will finally take decisive action on extending corporate liability for economic crime, given their call for evidence closed 2 years ago and we're still waiting for a response?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that this government has an exemplary record when it comes to clamping down on tax avoidance, evasion and non-compliance, including overseas. We've had our BEPS project that we've been in the vanguard of. We have the diverted profits tax brought in 2015 that has already raised or saved some £700 million. So we are very active in this space, and I refer her to my earlier answer in respect of as to why we've delayed the legislation today.
Ruth George.
Thank you very much. And I would echo the words of the chairs of the Select Committees for Treasury and Justice earlier, that the Minister's words that the Government will not focus on enforcing historic cases on IR35 will stick in the gullet of those like my constituents who are sick with anxiety at facing huge bills of over £100,000 relating to the loan charge. These are not affluent people, they are business people who've ploughed everything they have into their business and employing local people. Does the Minister understand just how stressful this is when they haven't even received their settlement amount from the Inland Revenue after the date at the end of February by which they were promised it?
I think, Mr. Speaker, it's
Minister.
very important for us to be extremely clear as to what disguised remuneration is all about. It is a situation where I, as an employer, instead of paying an employee in the normal manner, on which basis PAYE would be due, that would be income tax plus national insurance for the employee, national insurance for the employer, I say to the employee, look, we'll do it a different way. I'll send some money out, typically to a low or no tax overseas jurisdiction, into a trust. That money will then come back into the United Kingdom. It will be disguised as a loan, not a real loan, not a loan that the Honourable Lady and I would recognise, one that there's no expectation that this will be repaid. And as a consequence, because it's treated as a loan, not earnings, it attracts no tax at all. This government does not believe that that is right.
Nick Deakin.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. New clause 26 that was the government accepted agreed a review of the loan charge. My constituents that I've met with are ordinary folk who, when they were working for particular people, were told this was the arrangement they had to do. They are now suffering huge penalties, although they're still not clear exactly what they are, because HMRC keep changing the rules. So, following up the question for the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, will there be a proper independent review that reports by the 30th of March and does allow time before these things come in? Because what the Minister just said, and I like the Minister a lot, I think he's a good Minister, but what he just said suggested that the government's already determined the outcome of that review, and that's not very helpful.
Well,
Minister.
I'm sorry if the honourable gentleman formed that opinion. We are certainly not going to prejudge any review on any aspect of tax, whatever it may be. But I do gently say to him that as to those who got involved in these schemes, by and large, when it looks too good to be true, it is too good to be true. Where honourable members refer to very large demands for tax, they're therefore of necessity looking at situations where very large amounts of money went through tax avoidance schemes. And we have had debates in this House, Mr. Speaker, where members have raised tax demands on the part of their constituents up to £900,000. Now, in those circumstances, it would need about £2 million worth of income to go through one of these schemes in order to result in an unpaid tax bill of that magnitude.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister needs to clarify whether he's just writing a report or he's going to genuinely do a serious review. But he also said the bulk of the loan charge tax by volume had already been collected. However, 50,000 ordinary hard-working people are in despair and living in limbo, waiting to know if tax returns they put to bed years ago are to be reopened. And as I'm the Vice Chair of the APPG on loan charge, we heard from the family last week of a man who committed suicide over a small amount, but it was the shame and fear that he would go to prison that sent him over the edge. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Sunday Telegraph have reported on a leaked HMRC letter from 2011, which clearly shows that HMRC knew they were out of time for pursuing these cases back then. So will the Financial Secretary to the Treasury now admit that the real reason for the loan charge is HMRC's failure to act when they were legally entitled to, and that this is no good reason to undermine the rule of law by retrospectively rewriting the rules?
Well, if I could just correct one thing that the Honourable Lady has just said, is that I suggested that the bulk of the monies that will be due under the disguised remuneration measures that we're taking have already been collected. I'm pretty certain, Mr. Speaker, that I said that of the £1 billion that have been collected thus far, some 85% of that has come from companies as opposed to individuals, and that HMRC will go for the company before the individual. But we have to get back to the reasons for this charge, and I just set that out. And as to whether it is retrospective, as the Honourable Lady says, I can assure her there has been no time in our history as a taxing nation where this kind of structure, this kind of contrived arrangement, which is set up simply for the avoidance of taxation, has ever fallen appropriately within our tax code. It has never been right. These schemes have been taken through the court over a number of years. The schemes have also been taken not just through the general courts but also through the Supreme Court, and have always been found to be defective and not to work.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government's decision to pull tonight's vote on the remaining stages of the Financial Services Bill, which would allow the UK to continue to implement EU rules because it feared a defeat on the cross-party amendment on the introduction of beneficial ownership in Crown dependencies by 2020, is truly shocking. Does the Minister think that pulling that vote will dispel or heighten the concerns of the general public about the general chaos at the heart of this government, which we are currently enduring a mere 3 weeks from Brexit?
Well, no, Minister, it certainly won't heighten, I think, the public's any sense that the public may or may not have of chaos. What it will do is it will give the government now, on what has emerged as an extremely important constitutional matter, the time to reflect upon that, to make a measured and careful approach to our response to that, and the legislation, of course, will come back to the House in due course.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement. Since the last time this matter was raised in the House, what has the Minister done to close the loophole that has allowed big business to avoid paying the appropriate tax? Big business should not be trying to avoid paying tax, and instead they should be paying tax, their just taxes, and doing it cheerfully.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more with the honourable gentleman when he says that big businesses should be paying their fair share of tax, and that's why of the largest companies at any one time in the United Kingdom, half of them are being looked at very closely or being investigated by HMRC. That's not to say that they are doing anything wrong at all, but it is to indicate that we take, and HMRC takes, looking into the tax affairs of large companies extremely seriously. The honourable gentleman will be aware of the measures that we have brought forward in various finance bills specifically aimed at large companies, whether it's the legislation that's come out of the OECD BEPS project, or the diverted profits tax measures of 2015. So we do take this very seriously. We are a world leader at bringing in taxation, not least amongst large companies.
Thank you. Order. Yes, I will take all of the points of order. Point of order, Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Tonight a programme is going to be broadcast on national television. In fact, the screening is already happening, advanced screening for members in Committee Room 10 upstairs, that looks behind threats received online by members of Parliament across this House in relation to Brexit. My right honourable friend, the member for Edisbury, the right honourable lady, the member for Broxtowe, and myself have cooperated and appear in this documentary. I know that we're grateful to the police and all the authorities for their responses and for the prosecutions that have been launched after those threats. But this is a systematic intimidation and influence of the votes that MPs cast in this House. Next week, Mr. Speaker, we expect to have further key Brexit votes. Mr. Speaker, will this threat, and will you help us to ensure that this threat both to our democracy as well as